Hello, everybody. This is a video that I'm going to cover a lot of ground on culture and cultural values. The two PowerPoints, I just wanted to hit some high points because this is multicultural education and we need to have some definitions in. The one thing that I think you can teach kids, I'm going to try to make allusions or examples of ways you can teach children. First of all, what is culture? And culture is basically anything humans have touched. Volcanoes are not culture, okay? Objects made from volcanic glass, that is culture. So it's what people know and believe, their concepts, whether it's religion or philosophy, or how to fix motorcycles or whatever, whatever their basic thinking is going on. Anything that all the books, all the concepts, all the PowerPoints ever put together in one big pile would be culture. It's also what people do, whether it's an opera singer, a ditch digger, a pyramid builder, thousands of years ago, or somebody who's great at bowling, all of these activities, whatever they are, related to humans, are cultures. That's the second big concept, okay? So it's what they believe, what they know, what they think they know, what they do, and the third thing is what they make or use. Now, that could be almost anything. I've got a collection of things here. I've got a whiskey bottle. And notice it's empty. The cork's been out of it since about 1890. This was dug at Fort Sidney, Nebraska, and it's called a coffin whiskey flask. I paid $6 for it. It's a little iridescent there. And that's kind of like archaeology. I think Buffalo soldiers, or the African-American soldiers, are stationed at Fort Sidney, but I have to check. That's what I was told. What else? Coins, any coin. Here's something. I got some coasters from the old Soviet Union. This is communists proclaiming the great success of the revolution. Got all these things. Russian. I like this one. It's people saying, shh, don't say anything, which, in Russia, I read an article once, here's Lenin, said to be silent in Russian is an active verb. Other artifacts. Here's a great one. This is a predecessor to energy drinks. 1970s Jolt Cola. This had twice the caffeine of regular cola. I can assure you this thing has fizzed out, but I collect it. So, anything, arrowheads, ancient papyrus scrolls, mummies, our own bodies, whatever we do with them, what we wear, whatever. It's an artifact. This is what culture is. You can't miss it. It's 3 divisions. You could have an excellent little exercise with kids, teaching them what culture is. And that concept would be good for the rest of their life because it's a valuable and intellectual concept to teach children. You can see flags behind me. That's something big. Got the German flag and the flag of Wales. You don't see that too often. Books, etc. There's Audrey Hepburn, Moon River, from 1962 or 60. So culture it's not innate. It's not something you're born with. A lot of people have that misconception that you're born with culture. No, you're born as an organism on the earth, and you begin to be taught. You begin to learn how to behave, how to fit into society. And society is bounded by culture. It's everything. It is something shared among members of a group, whether it's a classroom in first grade, a high school band, or a horde of Mongols from from the 1300s that are busy invading Europe. They all have culture. Um, the one thing about culture that's interesting is you don't see your own culture because you think it's just the way everything is. But when you run into the person who is other than you, that is the stranger, then you realize that things aren't always the same and everything's different. You become confused. That's why it's good to have this little concept of culture, because you have to be flexible, because you can lose your life if you misinterpret or break the rules of another culture. Uh, that happened a lot of times among tribes thousands of years ago, and it happens now if you go in the wrong, if you go into a country and you violate some rules, you can end up in prison. And you thought all you were doing is just shaking hands with a lady, but you're not allowed to do that in certain countries. And to do that it can insult people. Culture is everywhere, and it can almost be nowhere. It's so everywhere that everything is the culture. And so, what is culture? It's not opera. I want to go with this. A lot of people think high culture is somebody singing in a high voice in an opera, or Beethoven, Mozart, or they think it's something like holidays and flags, and that's culture. It's everything. It is an acquired knowledge. People have to be taught a culture. They grow up in their culture. They learn all the rules, relationships with parents, and how to behave in a family, or not. It's constantly being changed, and that's why we get all this conflict in the world. Culture is constantly being changed. Any of the concepts about, the place of women in society, that has undergone a change. It used to be most women stayed at home and the men worked, and it wasn't feasible. And then we realized that we're wasting half of the brain power of our culture, our society, because we're not allowing the opportunities for women. And the whole concept, it keeps evolving. Whatever I say is still restrictive and could be considered not very liberal at all. That there is so much more beyond what we know now. Things will change in the future. It used to be that people were enslaved, and people thought that was normal and that was okay. And it wasn't just the United States with the Civil War, but I mean, historically, the attitude of those that were other than you or different than you not only were enemies, but also could become non-humans. You just do whatever you wanted to them because they were just, they could be owned. And so we've, for the most part, gone beyond that. But we still have the issue of war and how we think about our enemies in war. When do we quit killing people? When do we see them as human beings and not as enemies? We can look at all kinds of wars in history. Culture has to do with how we treat all the other objects in the world, living things. How do we treat the environment? How do we treat horses? I mean, how do we treat fish in the sea? Do we have obligations to them? Yes or no? Can we eat them? That's something else. Some cultures are pure vegetarian. And then so culture can be both objective and subjective. And it's actually all subjective, but objective is when you can see something and say, oh, here's a cup. And like I said, here's a glass, a whiskey glass that was used in the 19th century. So you don't see these anymore. It's not, people don't pack whiskey in little bottles like this. It's not efficient. The economy and business is different. So culture has changed in terms of the objects in the culture. And when you say objective, it means also the idea you understand something, you can see it, and it's concrete to you. But a lot of things are subjective. Even things that are objects can be seen differently. What does subjective mean? In the general sense, subjective is what you is below the level of consciousness. It's when you have certain assumptions about another culture. You may not even clearly be thinking about them. You may think, oh, I'm kind of afraid of that group of people, or there's something in the culture I don't like. I don't want to know about it. I don't want to eat that food. For me, it's caviar. I can't imagine eating fish eggs and calling it caviar and somehow it's being delicious. So we have our own personal versions of that were very subjective and almost unconscious fears or about things. We develop that, and you look at the unconsciousness, and that drives a lot of us. I always like to think about it, fear of the other, that which is different than me. You don't know about it, so as a child, sometimes you go through periods when you're very shy and you avoid things that are different, and sometimes children are very open to things. But generally, as human beings, we tend to be hesitant. We see something different we don't know, because in ancient times, you didn't know. That which was different was unknown, and what is unknown could be dangerous. You had to find out about it before you know for sure. So there are all kinds of assumptions and values in each culture. And successful intercultural communication depends upon being aware of subjective culture. And like I said, it's below the surface, not only in your own mind, but also when you're dealing with other cultures. You don't know what are the values they may have, and you may violate those. I always kind of go on the concept of fear and danger, because that's one thing that's pretty universal. That now, objective culture, and in my PowerPoint I have what you can see. You can see flags, you can see the artifacts I've shown you, you can hear the language, you can kind of study the politics of a country, and you see these manifestations. These are what people believe. Sports is a good example. Soccer. I don't get soccer very well. It's still an alien sport to me, although it's played, and a lot of you probably played it and have your kids playing soccer, and you know what the rules are of soccer. But it was always strange to me. You don't get to pick the ball up with your hands unless you're the goalie. Why is that? What's the basis of that? I don't know what the basis of. I don't know if you do either. But you can hit it with your head, and you can hit it with parts of your body, but you cannot use your hands. Okay? That's different than American football and basketball and baseball. We touch the ball. So that to me is a big gap there. But I can see the objective. I can see the playing soccer, and I can see the goal, and I can see all these things that are associated with it. Same thing with religion. You have the altar, or you have the church, and you have the hymnal. And then so when we go to another culture, we do little comparisons. We think, oh, if you go to this church and Hindu church, or do they have a hymnal? And no, they don't sing. And then, of course, when you go to different churches, Methodists, there's a lot of singing. Methodists really emphasize singing. That's how that particular version of Christianity evolved. In other churches, you already know what you're supposed to sing, like in the Catholic Church or maybe the Lutheran Church. And there is some use of hymnals, but not as much, because certain things people already know how to sing. Okay. So that's just one little example of objective and subjective culture. Now, subjective is tough because it's what's internal, so it's not just right on the surface. You can't tell what it's going to be. A lot of times we talk about surface culture and deep culture. And surface culture is, I think there's really an error in here, because the surface is on subjective. Surface is what you see. It's really the objective. That's an error in this PowerPoint. Surface is what you can see, but if you think about the ocean or a pond or something, what is under the surface? You don't know. What's under the earth? You don't know. So deep culture is usually the concept used with surface. Surface, light reflects off it and I can see it, whatever your objects or even your worship or even your dance. But the meaning of the dance, or the meaning of a quinceanera when a girl's turning 15 years old and has her ceremony in Mexican and other Latino churches, it's kind of like a debutante coming out. So the surface culture would be, oh yeah, I recognize that. Rich people have something like that when their daughter comes out to society. Now we didn't have that. I lived in Missouri. The concept is alien to me. But I did know that wealthy people might have a coming out party and they go to the big deal over in Omaha or someplace in St. Louis, and it would be for rich people. I always thought that coming out parties were for rich people. And then deep culture would be what is the purpose of that? What's going on? Being introduced in the upper class in society or being introduced in the local society. So I really like, ceremonies have important value to them. So we deal with, what I always tell people is you have to observe a long time to really see all the values in a culture. Even if you think you know what they are, you don't know what they are. Even if you see you're dealing with people that look like you, speak English like you, they're from a different town, they have a little different concepts. I noticed when I came from Missouri to Nebraska. Yeah, it's not like people are different or alien in any way, but even if they look like you in every other way, they still have their own little groups. And farming society in Nebraska, people are into quilting, and I knew some of that back in Missouri, but I noticed that in Nebraska, towns kind of have their own little groups, and you don't just walk into town and become a part of the group. It takes years to be accepted. And even though you think, I'll just blend right in, no, you don't, because everyone knows in that group that you're an outsider, and it takes time to be accepted. And this is a concept that's always interested me about small towns, that they have their own little culture, their own little set of rules. And people are finicky about it. They're kind of, not the word finicky, but they're kind of picky about it. And then I have a picture in there about U.S. culture and the different aspects of it. And you can see culture as, you can kind of label it by language, or you can label it by ethnicity. I don't really like these very much, because people that are very different culture can share a language. People that ethnicity, people can share an ethnicity but be quite different from each other. Same thing with religion. There are different types of Catholics, there are different types of Lutherans. They're not all the same. And there we go with another very important concept, which I think I have on the back of this. Wanted to get to, is that, I'm going to get to it in the next one. But we talk about what is American culture, and right now we're having a huge argument. It's in politics and everything. What is American culture? We talk about identity politics. We don't like somebody says, well, they define themselves a certain way, and we think, well, they're not of us. They're different than us. We don't agree. And so you get into all these concepts of, what is my culture? And it's really interesting. It's kind of tragic in a way, but I don't think you can get away from it, because there's always going to be differences. The question is, and I think I mentioned this in the other one, is how are we going to treat each other? I shouldn't be offended because you're different. I don't have to be like you, but I have to be respectful of your culture and of you. There can be times when things are so different, it's just incompatible. But generally speaking, we don't usually find that situation. We try to keep the differences so we don't end up in some kind of pitched battle over, we used to have religious wars. We generally now don't have religious wars. Europe was racked by people. Different groups, splinter groups might be oppressed by Protestants may go after another Protestant, or they may just have a general war with Catholics, or, it used to be going back earlier. The Romans persecuted the Christians, and now we have cases of, in Islam, some countries persecuting the Coptic people in Egypt, and Hindus. And I mean, I can cite religion and conflict and war and find all kinds of examples of it. Native Americans, it wasn't necessarily religion, but a whole terribly different set of values, concept of land, of honor, of lifestyle, of how people made their living, hunting and gathering society versus farming society. You can't have people going, if you have land, you can't have people coming on your land and putting in farms and putting up fences. Then we had in the Lincoln County wars in the West, we had the cattlemen trying to wipe out farmers, trying to put up fences, or ranchers that were trying to keep their cattle on land that they owned as opposed to open range. So we had range wars. That's where Billy the Kid and all these people got their jobs, trying to intimidate or kill people that had a different economic view of existence. So I put in things, I put in a list near here at the end, and, you know, everything from tortillas to build the wall to, I think I put in snowflakes, hip hop, the cloud, Trumpers, you know, it just keeps adding. You know, we find those that are different and we don't get along with them. We find other reasons not to get along with them. So the nature of culture, the nature of society is conflict. As teachers, how to teach, to show respect for differences and to learn about other people, not feel that you are at risk for your own identity. A lot of people used to get very upset if their kids converted to another religion. You'd just go crazy about it. It was losing your soul. You're going to hell if you change religions. That was a huge issue. And I can trace that all the way back to ancient times. So those are some things. And then on the other thing I want to deal with on cultural values, and what I am talking about are cultural values. When I talk culture, I'm not talking your DNA. Your culture is not your DNA. It doesn't come out of it. It's not something innate. It doesn't just spout out, you know, that, well, if your skin's a certain shade, or if your language is from a certain group, that you inherently, people actually thought after World War II, because of the wars with Nazi Germany, there were some people that put up propaganda even after into World War II that thought that the German language was autocratic and was dangerous to study, that if you spoke German, then you might be a Nazi or something. They actually put these crazy ideas out. And so it caused great discrimination against people that spoke a different language, whether it was Spanish or whether people thought they were plotting against you. They were talking about you because, you know, these Frenchmen and the British didn't get along, you know. Everybody spoke French as a kind of international language for many hundreds of years because it was the language of the elite cultural people. But then the English, you know, English now has kind of supplanted it. Before that, it was the Latin. Everyone spoke Latin because of the Roman Empire, and everybody respected empires. So what we find is that we're always trying to put up these walls, trying to wall off people because we're a little afraid of them. And so what do you do as a teacher? You know, it's a good thing to talk about this, but what are some concepts that are important to teach? Well, I'm going to tell you, teaching about culture is a little risky, so you have to consider what you say. I think about what I say on this video. I think, wow, what if I end up on the news because I slept with the tongue or something? We live in a very contentious or very sensitive society, and it pays not to make mistakes. So the big one for me is the stereotypes and generalizations, and there's a difference. If I have encountered people from country Y, we'll call it Y, X or Y, whatever, and I've noticed things about them. I notice things I like about them. I notice things I don't like about them. And then I encounter some other person who appears to be from that culture, may look like it, may talk like it, etc. And I go in and I say, "Oh, I know your culture. You're A, B, C, D, and F, and I don't like F. I don't like the D and the F in your culture. And I assume that's how you are." That is called a generalization. Because I don't know that person, I assume what I learned about other groups that I associate or connect them with, then I say, "Oh, you must be like this." Okay? And that is called a stereotype. I'm trying to put it in as neutral terms as possible. Most stereotypes, when you hear it, are negative. I would argue that any stereotype is actually negative, even a positive stereotype.